When Dr. James removed the first prisoner's worn uniform in that Texas medical building, he froze. What stared back at him would shatter every rule he'd sworn to follow and haunt every remaining day of his existence. This was no ordinary examination. This was something that would test whether one man's conscience could outweigh an entire army's orders. Spring dust hung in the air at Camp Swift as walked into the building in 1945. 40 German women sat waiting, silent and still, their expressions empty as winter trees. He'd checked thousands of captured soldiers, sailors, and pilots before this day, but nothing prepared him for what he discovered beneath those threadbare clothes. 3 weeks had passed since Europe's fighting stopped. Church bells celebrated across the nation. New York streets filled with falling ticker tape. Newsreels showed soldiers embracing their sweethearts. Yet here, 60 miles from Austin, the war's consequences were just arriving in cattle cars and military vehicles. These women traveled from a work camp near Bremen. Allied forces captured them while pushing through northern Germany. They'd spent months making uniforms, bandages, and surgical materials for enemy troops. Their ages ranged from 18 to 35. Guards labeled them support workers. The Geneva Rules classified them as war captives. Before enlisting, practiced medicine in rural Oklahoma, caring for farmers and ranch families. He recognized starvation. He knew infections, sickness, and the marks of extended hardship. But his 10 years treating patients never showed him anything like what waited inside those walls. The structure followed standard military design. White-painted wooden walls, rows of metal beds with thin mattresses, windows covered in mesh screens blocking Texas mosquitoes. Inside, the air smelled of cleaning solution mixed with something sharp and wrong that twisted his gut. Lieutenant Sarah, the camp's nursing director, stood by the door. She'd arrived 2 days earlier to organize the medical checks. Her face looked pale, her typical professional manner replaced by barely contained anger. "Sir," she said softly, "you need to know what we're facing before starting." Set his bag down. Outside, a guard shouted orders in that familiar Texas accent, casual and confident. Inside, 40 women watched every movement with the exhaustion of creatures expecting pain. "How serious?" asked. Passed him an initial assessment. Her writing stayed precise and clinical, but detected emotion bleeding through the medical language. 37 cases of severe starvation, 12 with advanced tuberculosis, 8 with untreated broken bones, infections that should have been addressed weeks ago now spreading through flesh and bone. "There's more," added, lowering her voice. 3 are expecting babies, 2 in their final months. None received any pregnancy care whatsoever. Something cold gripped his chest. Pregnant war captives. Women who'd crossed the Atlantic in cargo vessels, traveled in railway cars, marched through processing stations, all while carrying unborn children. The rulebook said nothing about this situation. He scanned the room. Some women returned his look. Others stared downward or at walls, expressions blank as empty pages. They'd been told Americans were vicious, that capture meant torture and death. Enemy propaganda painted vivid images of savage Yankees bayoneting prisoners, civilians spitting on the wounded, a nation of merchants and mixed races without honor or mercy. Instead, they found cattle ranches and dining hall, serving more food than they'd seen in years. Picked up his bag and approached the first bed. The woman sitting there looked about 22, with hair cut short and uneven, as if sheared without care. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers locked together, knuckles white. "I'm Captain," he said in careful German, the language his grandmother taught him back in Oklahoma. "I'm a physician. I must examine you to ensure you're healthy. Do you understand?" The woman nodded. Her blue eyes were ringed with shadows so dark they resembled bruises. Asked her to stand. She rose slowly as if sudden movements might break her like glass. When she removed her jacket, saw ribs pressing through skin like ladder rungs, collar bones sharp enough to cast shadows. Her arms showed old bruises, yellow and green at the edges, fatting but visible. He checked her heartbeat. Too rapid. Her breathing came shallow and labored with a wet rattle suggesting fluid buildup. Her fingernails were split and ragged, the beds underneath stained with chemicals that had burned away the natural color. "Have you been coughing?" asked. "Yes," she whispered, "for months." Made notes. Likely tuberculosis, severe starvation, chemical exposure matching factory work. He moved to the next woman, then the next. With each examination, the picture darkened. By midday, had checked 15 women. The pattern stayed consistent and damning. All showed prolonged hunger. All had untreated conditions ranging from serious to life-threatening. Several had injuries healed incorrectly, broken bones set at wrong angles creating permanent deformities. One woman had a compound fracture in her left arm that somehow mended without surgery, leaving limited movement and constant pain. Stopped at the 20th check and walked outside. Texas sun blazed overhead, turning the ground into shimmering heat and dust. He stood breathing deeply, trying to steady himself. Followed, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee despite the temperature. She handed one to without speaking. "They're dying," finally said, his voice rough and barely controlled. "Half have tuberculosis. The others are so starved they risk organ failure. And those 3 pregnant women." He stopped, unable to continue. "I know," replied. "I've already contacted headquarters. They're sending additional supplies and staff." Shook his head. "Supplies won't be enough. These women need intensive care, proper nutrition, rest, medications we don't have available. Some need surgery." He paused, looking back at the building. "Those pregnancies are extremely risky. Without immediate action, we could lose the mothers, the bobbies, or everyone." The regulations stayed clear. War captives received adequate medical attention as defined by military standards. Adequate meant treating urgent injuries, preventing disease outbreaks, maintaining basic health. It didn't mean intensive intervention. It didn't mean prioritizing prisoner care over military personnel. It certainly didn't mean dedicating limited resources to saving women who'd worked for the regime that started this war. But didn't become a doctor to follow regulations. He became a doctor because his father died of appendicitis when was 12, miles from the nearest hospital, too far for help to arrive. He watched his father's face turn gray, listened to labored breathing, felt utterly powerless as life slipped away in a farmhouse bedroom. He swore then never to feel that powerless again. That afternoon, filed an emergency request with the base commander. He outlined the medical situation in clinical detail, emphasizing the severity and potential for multiple deaths without immediate action. He requested permission to move the most critical patients to the base hospital, allocate additional nursing staff, obtain specialized medications and equipment. The response returned within 2 hours. Request: resources were limited. The war might ended in Europe, but fighting continued in the Pacific. Medical supplies were reserved for combat troops, not prisoners. The base hospital had wounded American soldiers needing care, was authorized to provide basic treatment within the building using available supplies. Nothing more. Read the response 3 times, his jaw tightening with each pass. Then he folded the paper, placed it in his desk drawer, and walked back to the medical building. Was treating one of the pregnant women when returned. The woman lay on a bed, her swollen belly visible beneath a thin blanket, breathing shallow and rapid. Had started an IV line pumping precious fluids into veins that looked ready to collapse. "How is she?" asked. "Preeclampsia," replied without looking up. "Blood pressure dangerously high. She needs to deliver soon or we risk losing both her and the baby." Moved beside the woman. Her name was Margaret, according to intake papers. 24 years old, a seamstress before the war, recruited for textile factories when the regime demanded total mobilization. She had a husband somewhere, captured by Russian forces during the retreat from Poland. She had no way of knowing if he lived or died. Margot's eyes opened. They were gray, clouded with pain and exhaustion. She looked at with an expression he'd never forget. Not fear, not anger, but resigned acceptance that tightened his throat. "Am I dying?" she asked in broken English. Pulled up a stool and sat beside her bed. He took her hand carefully, mindful of the IV line. Her skin felt cold despite the Texas heat. "No," he said firmly. "You're not dying, not on my watch." That evening broke the first rule. He requisitioned medical supplies marked for military personnel and redirected them to the prisoner building. Antibiotics, vitamins, clean linens, proper bandages. He signed requisition forms with creative descriptions that would pass through the supply chain without raising immediate questions. The next morning he broke the second rule. He brought in civilian physicians from Austin, colleagues he'd trained with before the war, people who understood that medical ethics crossed nationality and politics. They came quietly, arriving in unmarked vehicles, carrying their own equipment, asking no questions about authorization or payment. By the third day, had transformed the prisoner building into a working field hospital. He created sections for different conditions. One area for tuberculosis patients, isolated to prevent spread. Another for general starvation cases with carefully planned feeding schedules to prevent refeeding syndrome. A third for pregnant women, monitored constantly for complication signs. The base commander learned about unauthorized activities on the fourth day. He summoned to his office a converted warehouse smelling of cigar smoke and old paper. Colonel Warren sat behind a desk stacked with reports, his face weathered from decades of military service, his eyes hard as stone. "Captain," Warren began, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority expecting immediate compliance. "You've been operating outside your assigned parameters. You've redirected military supplies, brought in unauthorized personnel, and exceeded your medical authority." He paused, letting the words settle. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Stood at attention, his mind racing through possible responses. He could apologize, claim ignorance of regulations, promise to comply with orders going forward. He could protect his career, avoid court-martial, maintain the military discipline holding the entire structure together. Instead, he said, "Sir, with respect, those women are dying. I took an oath to preserve life. That oath doesn't include footnotes about nationality or prisoner status." Warren leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply studying with an expression that might been anger or might been something else entirely. "Do you know what this looks like?" Warren finally asked. "An American officer prioritizing enemy prisoners over his own soldiers, using military resources to save women who worked for the regime. The press gets hold of this, and you'll be. So will everyone associated with this camp." "Sir," replied, keeping his voice steady, "if the press learns we let 40 women die in our custody when we had the means to save them, the outrage would be considerably worse." Warren's expression shifted. Something that might been a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, gone before could be certain it was there. "You're a real pain," Warren said, "but you're not wrong." He pulled out a form and began writing. "I'm issuing you authorization for continued medical intervention. You'll report directly to me on all activities. You'll maintain detailed records. And if this explodes in our faces, I'm throwing you under the bus so fast it'll make your head spin. Understood?" Felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying drain from his shoulders. "Understood, sir." "Now get out of here and save some lives." Returned to the building and assembled his expanded medical team. 3 civilian physicians, 7 nurses including, and 2 medics who volunteered their off-duty hours. He briefed them on the cases, assigned responsibilities, outlined treatment protocols. The work was relentless. Dawn to midnight, 7 days weekly, moving between patients, adjusting medications, monitoring vital signs, making countless small decisions that collectively determined who would live and who would slip away. The tuberculosis cases responded slowly to antibiotics. Temperatures dropped, coughing diminished, color returned to gray faces. Watched women who'd been bedridden sit up, stand, and walk carefully around the building with assistance. The starvation cases required delicate management. Too much food too quickly would overwhelm systems adapted to hunger, potentially causing heart failure. Designed feeding schedules that gradually increased caloric intake, balancing the need for nutrition against the risk of refeeding syndrome. He watched weights climb 2 pounds, 5 pounds, 10 pounds, flesh slowly covering bones that had protruded like cliff edges. But the pregnant women worried him most. Margot's preeclampsia remained unstable despite medication. The second woman, Helena, showed signs of placental insufficiency, meaning her baby wasn't receiving adequate nutrition through the umbilical cord. The third, Anna, had developed an infection threatening both her life and her unborn child's. Consulted with an obstetrician in Austin, a woman named Doctor who delivered hundreds of bobbies in her 40-year career. She arrived at Camp Swift on a Saturday morning, examined the 3 women, and delivered her assessment with characteristic bluntness. "The first one needs to deliver within 48 hours, said, referring to Margot. "The second might make it another week, but I wouldn't bet on it. The third needs immediate surgery to clear that infection or she'll go septic." "Can we do the surgeries here?" asked. Looked around the building. The makeshift surgical area had set up, the sterilized instruments laid out on metal trays, the portable lights rigged from maintenance equipment. "It's not ideal," she admitted, "but I've delivered bobbies in stranger places. During the Depression, I once performed an emergency cesarean in the back of a pickup truck." She met eyes. "If we're doing this, we need to do it now. No more waiting." They operated on Anna first. The infection had spread through her pelvic region, creating abscesses that had to be drained and cleaned. Assisted, his hands steady despite the cramped conditions and inadequate lighting. Monitored anesthesia, adjusting dosages with careful precision. 2 nurses stood ready with instruments, supplies, blood plasma if needed. The surgery lasted 3 hours. When finally stepped back, her scrubs were soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air, but Anna's vital signs were stable and the infection was cleared. "One down," said. "Let's get some rest and tackle the others tomorrow." But Margot's condition worsened overnight. Her blood pressure spiked, her hands and feet swelled with fluid retention, and she began experiencing seizures, signs of eclampsia, the potentially fatal progression of preeclampsia. Made the decision at 4 in the morning. Emergency cesarean section performed immediately despite the risks. Arrived within 30 minutes. They worked by lamplight, hands moving through procedures he'd only read about in medical textbooks, trusting guidance and his own instincts. The baby came out small and blue, not breathing. For several terrible seconds thought they'd lost him. Then suctioned the infant's airways, and a thin wail pierced the building. The baby's color shifted from blue to pink, his tiny fists clenching as he drew breath after breath. Margot, still under anesthesia, couldn't hear her son's first cry, but saw tears tracking down's face as she wrapped the infant in clean blankets. They named him Thomas after his father. It seemed appropriate somehow, a life saved in the place where had learned the terrible cost of helplessness. Helena delivered 4 days later naturally, but with complications requiring steady expertise. Her daughter arrived small but healthy with a shock of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly. Anna, recovering from her surgery, was able to deliver 3 weeks later once the infection had fully cleared. Her son came screaming into the world angry and vital. By midsummer, the transformation was visible to anyone who entered the building. Women who'd arrived skeletal now showed the soft curves of proper nutrition. Faces that had been hollow and gray now carried color. The tuberculosis patients were recovering, their lungs clearing, their energy returning. The broken bones had been properly set and splinted. The infections had been cleared, and 3 Bobbies slept in makeshift cribs, watched over by mothers who'd been given a chance at survival. The other prisoners noticed. German soldiers in adjacent compounds heard about the American doctor who'd broken regulations to save enemy lives. Word spread through the prisoner network, carried in whispered conversations and smuggled notes. Became something unexpected, a symbol of the strange contradiction that was American power, a nation that could wage total war with industrial efficiency, yet whose doctor would risk court-martial to save the lives of women from the defeated regime. One evening in late August, sat outside the building, watching the Texas sunset paint the horizon in shades of orange and purple. Joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee that had become their evening ritual. 40 women, said quietly, all alive, all recovering. Nodded, the number felt both enormous and impossibly small. 40 lives saved against millions lost, a tiny victory in a war that had consumed continents. Do you ever wonder if it was worth it? Asked. Breaking all those rules, risking your career, spending every waking hour fighting regulations and supply chains and military bureaucracy. Thought about Margaret, who'd asked him if she was dying. He thought about Thomas's first breath, Helena's daughter's fierce cry, Anna's son's vital rage. He thought about the women who could now walk unassisted, who laughed sometimes, who sang German folk songs in the evenings when they thought no one was listening. Every single day, replied, and every single day the answer is yes. The war ended in the Pacific in September. Japan surrendered after the deployment of weapons so devastating that could barely comprehend the reports filtering through military channels. The world began the long, painful process of reconstruction, counting the dead, figuring out how to build peace from the ashes of total war. The German women were eventually returned home, sent back to a homeland that no longer existed in the form they remembered, received letters occasionally, updates about their lives. Margaret found her husband alive, reunited with him and Thomas in a displaced persons camp near Hamburg. Helena became a teacher, raising her daughter in a country learning to confront its past. Anna immigrated to Canada with her son, built a new life in a place without the weight of old memories. Stayed in the Army for another 5 years, then returned to Oklahoma. He opened a practice in the same rural area where his father had died, treating farmers and ranchers and anyone else who needed care. He never spoke publicly about his time at Camp Swift, never sought recognition or praise for what he'd done. But in his office, barely visible unless you knew to look, he kept a photograph. 40 women standing together in the Texas sunlight, their faces showing the first hints of health, their eyes carrying something that might be hope. 3 Bobbies held in their mother's arms. And in the back corner, barely in frame, Captain James and Lieutenant Sarah, their white coats bright against the dust-brown landscape. Years later, when historians began documenting the prisoner system during the Second World War, they would find detailed medical records. They would read his reports, his unauthorized requisitions, his careful documentation of every decision that had violated regulations in service of the oath he'd taken. They would note that he'd been reprimanded twice, recommended for court-martial once, and ultimately received a commendation from the Surgeon General for exceptional medical service. But the records couldn't capture what himself understood, that the 40 lives saved at Camp Swift represented something larger than medical intervention or humanitarian aid. They represented a choice made by one man in one place at one moment to prioritize the fundamental obligation of medicine over the convenient classifications of wartime politics. In Germany, they'd been workers for the regime, complicit in the machinery of conquest and oppression. In the Atlantic crossing, they'd been prisoners, stripped of identity and agency. But in that Texas building under care, they'd become simply what they always were. Human beings whose lives mattered, whose suffering demanded response, whose survival was worth fighting for, regardless of uniform or nationality or the angry denunciations of those who believed mercy had no place in the aftermath of war. Bobbies grew up. Thomas became an engineer. Helena's daughter became a physician. Anna's son became a teacher. They lived lives their mothers had nearly lost, raised families of their own, contributed to the slow rebuilding of a shattered world. And though most of them never knew the full story of their births, never understood how close they came to never existing, they carried forward something essential. Proof that even in the darkest times, individual choices of compassion could ripple forward through generations. Died in 1983 at age 74 in the same Oklahoma farmhouse where his father had passed decades earlier. His obituary mentioned his military service, his long career in rural medicine, his dedication to his community. It didn't mention Camp Swift or the 40 women or the regulations he broke. But at his funeral, 3 old women attended. They'd traveled from Germany, from Canada, their faces lined with age but still recognizable to anyone who'd seen that photograph. They stood together at the graveside, said nothing, and placed 40 white roses on the casket before departing. The other mourners didn't understand the gesture. Children asked who the women were, what connection they had to their father. But's wife, who'd heard the story late one night many years earlier, simply smiled and said they were people whose lives her husband had touched. It was, she knew, the most profound understatement she would ever make. In the Texas heat of 1945, Captain James had seen women dying and made a choice. Not because regulations authorized it, not because military policy encouraged it, not because anyone would reward or recognize it, but because he was a doctor. And doctors save lives. And some obligations transcend the temporary classifications of war and peace, victor and defeated, us and them. 40 lives, 3 Bobbies, one man who understood that the measure of civilization is not how we treat our friends in times of peace, but how we treat our enemies in times of crisis. The sun set over Camp Swift that August evening, casting long shadows across the compound. Inside the building, women slept peacefully for perhaps the first time since their capture. Bobbies nursed at their mothers' breasts, and Captain sat outside drinking coffee with Lieutenant, knowing that he'd broken every rule in the book, and that he would do it all again without hesitation. Because some things are worth fighting for, even when, especially when, no one is watching, no one is keeping score, and history might never remember your name.